I'm Connor Rebush, and if you are interested in the finer points of face punching, you've come to the right place. This is Heavy Hands. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands, your place for the finer points of face punching. I'm your host, Connor Rebush. With me, as always, is my dear friend, Patrick Wyman. Pat, welcome to another episode of Heavy Hands.
It's good to be here again.
I feel like I should no longer be welcoming you to the show.
Yeah, for what is this, like the 27th episode we've done together?
I think I just want to, I think subconsciously I want to give you the impression that your position is tenuous. You're like walking a tightrope, like, welcome to another one, Pat. I don't know how many more you'll get, but you're here today.
Well, no, it's important. You've got. I think you need to have that element of risk to keep your head in the game.
I'm a very Machiavellian podcaster. That's how I would describe myself.
Machiavellian podcaster, I think, is two words that have never been put together ever.
Good band name too.
That actually is good. Really good.
Today, folks, we are talking about this stupendous fight card that is coming up. Last week, of course, we took a look at both Lyoto Machida and Rockhold through the lens of open stance fighting. So if you want to know how a southpaw fights an orthodox fighter and vice versa, go ahead, check back on last week's episode. You can find it on Bloody Elbow, who we are now brought to you by. I almost forgot that. And you can also find it on our website, heavyhandspodcast.com. And today, however, we've got a slightly different topic. We're gonna talk about these fights in a more specific sense because, of course, Lyoto Machida and Rockhold normally have that open stance style of engagement, but now fighting each other, we find ourselves in a closed stance bout. Two southpaws fighting one another often ends up being an ugly fight or an especially violent one. Southpaws tend to struggle with defending attacks from other southpaws. Then again, Lyoto Machida comfortable switching stances, so maybe we'll end up with a bit of a forced open stance fight anyway. Also on that card, we have the other fights we're going to discuss. We were looking forward to discussing Jacare Souza versus Yoel Romero, who Pat loves so much that in the past he has described him as his spirit animal.
He is, in fact, my spirit animal, and just watching just to make myself extra sad about Romero getting pulled from the fight. I watched the section of the Road to the Octagon special where it featured him doing. I mean, it sounded like he was trying to sing in church, but his voice box is not capable of making those particular sounds.
He cannot make music.
Somebody tweeted at me describing the sound of Romero's voice as 100-year-old chain-smoking Cuban boxing coach.
Yes.
And that sounds about right.
Yes. He sounds like a very old but very powerful man. He has the voice of a Greek god.
He sounds like what I imagine Zeus sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was thinking. I have images of Yoel Romero just descending from a mountaintop and just bellowing. And
Que Dios te bendiga. God,
normal human throats can't manage it.
They can't. Gravelly does not begin to describe the timbre of Yoel Romero's voice.
Gravel's too fine. It's a rock slide. But unfortunately now Ronaldo Souza is set to choke Chris Camazzi out again. The last fight, by the way, that they had, the quickest I've ever seen anyone go unconscious from being choked. Jacare put Camazzi in a head-arm choke, and I swear by the time the choke was locked on, Camazzi maybe was conscious for another second and a half, 2 seconds. And he
didn't even have time to do the should I tap thing.
He didn't even have time for his hand to come up and then fall down. He was just he was completely taken off guard. So impressive. We both have a feeling that Souza will probably get a little striking practice in with Camazzi this time, so it may not be as dominant, but by design. But of course, I digress. Other fights in this card that are worth discussing: Swanson versus Mack Holloway. Wipe your chins right now. I know everybody who's an MMA fan is drooling at the mere mention of that fight, and I think we've got some really interesting dynamics through which to view that matchup. And then, of course, we want to talk about Jim Miller versus Beneil Dariush, and I think that's all that we really want to focus on.
Yeah,
Boy,
there's
Sterling
also
Mizugaki's a good fight too, though.
Yeah, that I was just going to say I am a big Aljamain Sterling fan. He's a super cerebral guy, very smart, really puts his game together in very intelligent ways. But I don't know that we'll have time to really dig into that one today.
And if we had limitless time, I'd also love to talk George Sullivan versus Tim Means, which is just bound to be the grimiest fight ever seen on a UFC prelim.
That is a fight that was destined to take place in a strip club parking lot at 4 a.m.
Absolutely.
I mean that in the best. Like, that is not an insult to Sullivan and Means, because I would like for there to be a crowd of 20,000 people around said strip club parking lot. Just describing how straight up mean, nasty, and violent that's going to be.
Yep. Absolutely. But today, Lyoto Machida versus Luke Rockhold, Cub Swanson versus Max Holloway, Jim Miller versus Beneil Dariush. Stay tuned for discussion of all of those fights and more. But before we do that, we have a question from the heavy bag for you. So without further ado, why don't we go to the heavy bag? And our question this week comes to us via Martin Nunez. Martin writes, "Hey guys, I was listening to episode 44 again. I wish I knew our own show well enough to recall what episode that was."
I honestly have no idea. I may keep reading the question and I'll look that up.
Okay, great. I was listening to episode 44 again, and I realized that it seems like a lot of fighters seem to think of game planning in terms of tactics. That's the way it seems when they give interviews anyway, given that they claim they don't game plan because it could go wrong if the openings they trained for aren't there. And so fighters that say that kind of thing, this is me giving an aside, guys like Cowboy Cerrone, guys who notoriously do not like to game plan. He continues, "Do you have any insight into why that seems to be the case? I understand that the fighter's coach is probably making a game plan anyway, but I think most of us have heard fighters say something along those lines. Is it just that more people are tactically minded versus strategically minded, or anything like that? Thank you kindly, Martin Nunez." Thank you, Martin. He's, by the way, at Marti, M-A-R-T-I _Lata, L-A-T-A, on Twitter. So
I looked at episode 44, and that was the one where we did a listener mail episode, and we talked a lot about how we watch fights and how we analyze fights.
Great. Okay. Fantastic.
Yeah. So what's your thought on that, Connor? Why do you think that so many guys are thinking in terms of tactics instead of strategy for game planning?
To a certain extent, I think a lot of these guys don't really understand game planning, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily a fighter's job to understand what putting together a strategy actually entails. A good trainer will be able to recognize if his fighter is actually suited to knowing the details of the game plan or not. If there's a type of guy who, for example, would get way too caught up in the details in his own head and is just better just to go out there and fight, then the coach would probably be putting a game plan together anyway and training him on the pads and giving him sparring partners that reflect certain things that he wants to do, and just giving him general guidelines in sparring to cultivate the kind of approach he wants without the fighter having to think about the approach.
And that doesn't necessarily make the fighter not a smart fighter or a bad fighter by any stretch of the imagination. Like, off the top of my head, thinking of a couple of guys who fit that mold very neatly. Donald Cerrone, whom you just mentioned, who is a very smart fighter and a very tactical and a very adaptable fighter,
yes.
But not really one who wants to think in terms of strategy. Rory McDonald is like that.
Really?
Ross does all of Rory's game planning for him. Like, Rory will watch film, but he doesn't want to think about that. That's Faraz's job as far as their relationship is concerned. Pretty much all of Rafael Cordero's fighters, with a couple of exceptions, don't do that themselves. Rafael does it for him.
I don't. I'm certainly not a high level mixed martial artist, but I think of myself as a smart person, and I am the same way. I think that I do much better when I have direction and when I do not have to think. So. Doesn't make you dumb. It just makes you a different mentality. Everyone's mentality is limited in other ways and expanded in others. So I also think, however, there are coaches out there who don't game plan well for their fighters, or who think that putting together a game plan, guys like Joe Lozon, maybe, who I think puts together a lot of his own strategizing. Mm-hmm. And I think Joe Lozon does think that way, because Joe Lozon is such a move-focused guy. He's always about the, like, he's one of those guys who is, especially in terms of grappling, is like an encyclopedia of ways to hurt somebody. So he's got all these different little tricks to finishing his arm bars and his chokes and kimuras and knee bars and whatnot. He's a submission machine. And so I think because he's always got those ideas running through his head, he doesn't want to become too fixated on one. But I think that, more to your question, I think that kind of belies a misunderstanding of what a game plan is. Because while a game plan is made up of a series of tactics, those are really tactics in the broadest sense. And at the heart of the game plan, the specific tactics don't matter. Like, I'm not going to say, okay, you have to jab when he does this because that's his tell that he's going to throw his right hand. You know what I mean? That might be changing from fight to fight. That's a good point. But if I think in my head, okay, we have to push him backwards to win because he can't fight off of his back foot. He doesn't counter, and he retreats in a straight line. So we need to push him backwards to the fence. And he does have an initial counter, and it's a right hand, so we want to throw a dipping jab to start that. So we are going to train pushing him backwards and leading combinations with the jab, double jab, so he doesn't counter. Like, that is not a tactic that is likely to be taken away from you by the fighter changing. Because if a guy has certain things that he's uncomfortable with, for example, being pushed backwards, those take a long time to change. You're going to notice when a guy starts to make those gradual adjustments. So if you look at a guy's past fights and you're like, okay, he sucks at going backwards in all of them, you can safely strategize for that with very, very little chance of it changing. Would you agree, Pat?
I would. And I think that what this comes down to at the heart of it is the difference between things that are fundamental to your opponent's style and things that are incidental to your opponent's style.
Yes.
Great way to put it. And I think that there is a lot of confusion about what's fundamental and what's incidental. And this comes back to a lot of what we've talked about in terms of our Styles Make Fights series, breaking down the different archetypes of fighters. What makes you fall into one of those archetypes is fundamental. Those are things that are fundamental to your style, and those two the really two defining factors there are directionality of movement and where in the space of the cage you want to be. Right. So those things that are fundamental. Everything else can change. Everything else, none of the rest of it matters. It's a matter like in terms of the broadest arc of your game plan. Sure, you can throw some tactical suggestions in there. You don't know whether they're still going to be there or not, but it's not bad to work on those things. You know what I mean?
So why don't we put this in perspective of Pat and I both have done scouting reports for fighters, and we're not necessarily game planning for them. That's obviously the job of the coach. But we are we're providing the data on which a game plan can be based. And when I do a scouting report, I do like to give some tactical suggestions based on what I think the fighter, the fighter my client, basically, it sounds really pompous to say, but the fighter who has requested the scouting report is good at doing. And you can also look at my articles, for example, the ones that I do where I'm game planning to beat a champion. The one I've done it on Renan Barão. I did one recently on Anthony Pettis. I did one for Chad Mendes against Jose Aldo. In those, I will give some tactics that are best suited to executing the game plan, but it's really about it's about the effect of those tactics rather than on the specific openings. Like, often I will suggest that you throw a particular punch not because it's guaranteed to land or because the guy's particularly open for it, but because he reacts to it in a way that helps the rest of your game to come together. The specific tactics, they can't be too specific because that is when you end up with the rug pulled out from under your feet if it doesn't work. And they have to suit the general idea. The concept is much more important in a strategy or game plan than the tools you use to carry that concept out.
Yes, absolutely. It's the difference between I think the conceptual level is the really important thing. To bear in mind here. And so the way that I would take that is, we talked about these scouting reports. I would not. I don't even give tactical suggestions anymore. I used to in my scouting reports, but I don't anymore. Simply because I think I don't want to bear the responsibility if those holes are closed and there's some risk associated with trying to execute those strategies or with trying to execute those tactics. I don't want to have it on my hands that I put them in a position to get finished. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? So I don't even give tactical suggestions anymore unless there's something that this guy has done wrong in every single fight, and I'm fairly certain that his coaches, just for whatever reason, don't see it. If there's something glaringly obvious, then I'll point it out. But for the most part, I won't do that. I keep my suggestions strictly strategic and about direction of movement, where they like to be, what are their strengths rather than what are their weaknesses.
Yeah, and I think I was just going to say that actually, as it pertains to the fighter who is receiving the game plan, because I think one of the most important things about putting together a strategy is not to try and find the opponent's weaknesses, because those may change. It's rather to how can you play to your fighter's strengths? How can you put him in a position where he is most comfortable and most effective? Like you want the ratio of your effectiveness to the opponent's effectiveness to be as wide in your fighter's favor as possible. Yep. So, the specific openings, those change, but the fundamental aspects, I love what you said. Fundamental versus incidental is a great way of thinking of it. Incidental things like, oh, he always drops his hand before he jabs, like that's too specific. If that goes away and you've built your game plan on it being an opening, you're lost. But if
with that said, there are endemic tactical flaws that guys do, that some guys have. Like sure. Michael Bisping, God bless him, still pulls his jab back to his chest every time. Still, every single time he throws his jab, it comes back to his chest. That opening was there. That opening was there in his first fight in the UFC, and it was still there in his last one. Yeah, 22 fights later.
But I think even those are not necessarily things you have to game plan for. You don't necessarily have to tell your fighter what to do. Rather, find somebody he can spar with who drops his left hand and pulls his head straight up when he withdraws from a jab, and then in those sparring sessions, tell your guy specifically then how to get to him. That way he knows what it feels like.
You should be able to read if you're good enough to be striking at a high level in the UFC. You're good enough to see that live. You don't need to drill that all that much, I don't think.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. Okay, so hopefully that answers your question, Martin. Thank you for writing us. If you listening at home have questions for us, again, you can send them to us on Twitter, #HeavybagQuestions. You can also send longer questions, like that one was, to our email, Connor, CONNOR, @heavyhandspodcast.com. And so that concludes this installment of the Heavy Bag. We're going to take a quick break now. When we come back, we'll start talking about all of the fun matchups for UFC on Fox 15, starting, of course, with Lyoto Machida versus Luke Rockhold. Okay, wait, stop. Don't skip this break. I know you skip most of them. It's a podcast. It's not a radio show. You don't have to listen to the commercials. But if you follow my very simple instructions, you'll be doing a huge service to Heavy Hands, Pat, and myself. First, go to Stitcher.com or iTunes.com. You can use either of those services to subscribe to the show, which makes it really, really easy to listen to every episode and not have to go hunting for it on our confusing, badly designed website. Once you're there, give us a positive rating and a positive review. That means go to the little 5-star thing and click on the star all the way to the right. That's a 5-star rating. That's the best one you could possibly give us, and like 20 or 30 words about how you enjoy the show. It may not seem like much, but it's a huge help to us, and we really appreciate it. It helps us bring Heavy Hands to an ever-increasing audience, which is just good for everybody. So thank you for listening. Please take the time to give us a positive rating and review. Next time that you're on at your computer, at your phone, whatever, iTunes.com, Stitcher.com, search for Heavy Hands, give a positive rating and a review. Thank you. And now, back to the show. And we are back. We're going to talk to you about Lyoto Machida versus Luke Rockhold, two southpaws, two middleweights. An interesting matchup. Pat, you have the interesting perspective on this. I think you have kind of what may seem to some to be a bold prediction.
Yeah, I actually like Rockhold in this fight. I think that really beating Machida, unless you can totally and completely overpower him the way that John Jones did, and even Jones had trouble with him for about the first 6 minutes of the fight, is to take what Machida gives you. And for the most part, what Machida is going to give you are rangy kicks. And that's something that Rockhold does really, really well. Rockhold is a very patient fighter. He's perfectly willing to take what's there as opposed to trying to force the matter. And he's a very good kicker. And he'll kick. Unlike Machida, Machida really doesn't kick off his right side hardly at all. I mean, he barely.
He used to a lot more than he does now. He very rarely does it as a little setup for the left hand, as kind of a cheat way to get his right foot outside the orthodox opponent's left.
Yeah, very common karate thing. We see Vitor Belfort do that a lot. Yeah, like you throw like a low calf kick. And then you come, and then you get all your weight behind the left hand that follows it. Also something, tear rolls down my face as I say this. Also something Yoel Romero does very well. But I want to talk about Romero. I hope you can hear how sad I am.
It's sheer
pour one
sorrow
out for the Vicar of Violence.
It is, by the way, it is something that has faded from his game because Machida, for example, if you were to look back at his fight with Tito Ortiz, lots of right low kicks.
Yep.
Lots of kicks off the right leg and left leg. He used to throw a lot of slappy kicks. Now he's kind of traded that in favor for the much more Rafael Cordero-styled murderous left round kick to the body and head.
Yeah, and he will throw that hard. So based on what we've seen from them recently, it would not at all surprise me if Machida went back to doing that. But I think based on what we've seen from them in the recent past, I think that Rockhold is more likely to win a rangy kicking battle. That doesn't mean that Machida can't, or that I'm extremely confident in that. But I think that based on what I've seen, I like Rockhold right there.
And he is himself a very dynamic kicker who kicks off of both legs. He loves his Brazilian kicks, obviously, throws decent spinning kicks, probably as well as Machida throws them. Machida's never been an amazing spin or a turning round kick guy or anything like that.
Yeah, and Rockhold also, it's hard to overstate how rangy Rockhold is. And I think that's like Machida had a lot of trouble with that when he fought Weidman, when Weidman was kicking at him from long range. And Rockhold is both a better kicker than Weidman and substantially longer, I think, especially in the legs. You look at the way that Rockhold is built, and he's all arms and legs, So I think that's just going to be hard for Machida. And unless either guy can somehow manage to land the big shot, if this goes the distance, I think that, being able to land an extra 3, 4, 5 kicks around could very well be the difference in the fight. And kind of on that basis, I'm leaning towards Rockhold. I also think that Rockhold is better with his lead hand, and in a matchup of two southpaws in a closed guard matchup, that becomes increasingly important.
That's true. However, Machida's shown a nice proclivity recently for a propensity, I should say, for the overhand left. That Cordero training has really influenced Machida's approach, the tactics that he uses and the way in which he uses them. And overhand, good weapon against a tall guy. Of course, this is the danger of game planning, getting caught up in the specific tactics. Here's the thing. I have a question to pose for you. Obviously, a lot of what you're saying probably plays in the fact that Machida didn't look great against another tall, strong wrestler with kicks and range like John Jones, and another big guy like Chris Weidman. He's struggled against guys who can basically outsize him or outstrength him or compete with him at range. Do you think we are up for a different matchup now that he's against a guy whose frame is similar to John Jones, but we have a very different version of Machida than we had years ago when Machida fought the light heavyweight champion? Now that Machida is so much more comfortable and so much more willing to come forward, and really chase guys down. Of course, that his favorite come forward weapon now is that left kick, which is not going to be there quite as easily because of the closed stance. But do you think that plays into this at all? Do you think Machida might look to push Rockhold backwards?
Yeah, and I think he will, but I think the danger then is that Rockhold is a very good counter fighter. I mean, he's obviously not on Machida's level as a counter fighter, but he throws. But we talked a lot last week about the counter right hook that Rockhold likes to throw. So I don't think it's a given that if Machida wants to come forward and he wants to blaze away with that left kick or with a straight left, it's not a given to me that he can get out of there without eating Rockhold's right hand. Like in tight spaces, in punching exchanges, Machida's defense has never been as good as it is when he's able to pick you off at range. And I think that if Machida wants to come in and he wants to bang like that, I think he's gonna have some problems against a bigger, harder puncher.
Yeah. Now the interesting thing of this matchup too is that Machida hasn't fought another southpaw since Rich Franklin. It's been a long time since Machida fought a southpaw. Obviously, his last attempt against a southpaw, being that Rich Franklin fight, was a pretty good endorsement for his abilities. He pasted Franklin with ease. But, again, let's see this. How many southpaws has Rockhold fought? He fought Souza. He fought Jacare and did very well.
Jacare is orthodox.
Oh, I'm sorry. What am I thinking?
He fought Vitor Belfort, who knocked him out.
Yeah. I doubt that Machida's going to be throwing lots of right hooks and spinning wheel kicks, though.
Yeah, I think that. Yeah, I think Vitor was a difficult matchup for him for a variety of reasons, but it's hard to take much from a fight where a dude gets spinning kicked 3 minutes into it.
It's true, though. I think he was pretty soundly losing the fight the entire time. Now that's the thing. If Machida doesn't have necessarily the durability of somebody like Belfort, he didn't have the incredible juiced to the gills powers that Belfort was demonstrating in that matchup. He doesn't have the power of Belfort. But I do think that there is a weakness to Rockhold's game when he gets himself pressed up against the fence. As a defensive wrestler, he's amazing off of the fence. The wrestling that he employed when he fought Jacare Souza was incredible. He gets underhooks like nobody's business. He takes angles. I mean, he's just almost impossible to get down when he's in that position. And if he does go down, he's right back to his feet. He's a very good cage wrestler. But in terms of being pressured to the fence, if that is indeed Machida's plan, it's really just the right hook. I'm not sure that I've seen anything in Rockhold that suggests that he's added any new counters to his game. For example, a left uppercut would be great. A good defensive punch to catch a guy who comes lunging in while he's backed up. He does try a check hook. He does try to get himself out of there with this hook, but that was where he wound up in trouble against Belfort, is that he found himself pressed towards the cage again and again and again, and his movement became predictable, and he ended up getting caught into a kick while he was trying to avoid something else.
Yeah, that's true. That's not a bad point at all. I mean, I think, to me, the big thing about Rockhold in this fight is that even if he marginally loses the striking, I think that he's so much better everywhere else that's his path to victory.
Yeah, and that's a very good point. Rockhold, I think, is an incredibly underrated wrestler.
I mean, I'll put it to you. I'll put it to you this way: Rockhold could very well win a pure striking matchup with Lyoto Machida, and striking is Rockhold's worst skill set.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, I actually don't think that Rockhold is a great offensive wrestler. I think he's solid, but I don't think he's particularly outstanding there. He is a fantastic defensive wrestler, and he's a fantastic counter grappler, and he's fantastic in scrambles. So he's one of these guys. If he backs you up to the fence, he's going to knee the crap out of you, first and foremost. He's one of the very best clinch fighters in the division. In a division full of outstanding clinch fighters, Rockhold is one of the very best. So he's going to beat you up like that for a little while. He's going to try and trip you. Even if you don't go all the way down, if you expose your back as you're falling and trying to catch yourself, then he will immediately hop on your back. He doesn't have to get you all the way down to put you in serious trouble on the mat. And I think that that's where Machida could run himself into trouble here. So Machida is very hard to hold in the clinch, and he's very hard to take down, especially from the clinch. But he can be forced into transition. Like, I don't think Machida is a great transitional fighter, and he never really has been. He thrives from phase to phase.
Yeah.
And so I think that Rockhold is better in those transitional spaces, and if he can force Machida into trying to escape the clinch too hastily, then I think there are going to be more openings for him. I think he's got to force transitions between spaces and between phases if he wants to win.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point. And in a sense, Machida is really kind of a product, an artifact of a bygone era where he is just exceptionally good in each of his phases, not necessarily in his submission grappling. I think that's probably his weakest. But I also think we've seen some improvements there recently.
Oh, absolutely! Against Weidman, he was better than he has ever been,
and he looked very potent off of his back against Gegard Mousasi. Certainly more so than Mousasi seemed to expect, where he was throwing up omoplatas and chaining to triangles, and actually managing to get back to his feet. But that's the thing. Machida has always been a guy who, if you engage him in a striking battle, he will most likely figure out a way to beat you, or he will at least keep you in danger the entire time. He's not always been he's been kind of risk averse in the past, but hasn't, it's very difficult to beat him in a pure fight, a pure striking battle. Then you've got, if you're engaging him in the wrestling, outstanding clinch wrestler. His takedown defense is absolutely superb. And he's also a solid takedown artist himself, though not with traditional wrestling style takedowns. And then submission grappling, pretty strong there. But going from one to the other, as I think where opponents who have actually definitively beaten him have done so. Weidman did an excellent job, using his boxing, using his kicks, using his clinch fighting, and going for takedown attempts. All of these things just keeping Machida occupied and busy and preventing him from ever getting into his counter rhythm. And John Jones did the same thing. The moment that John Jones lunged into a headlock, transitioned to a double leg, put Machida on the ground, and hit him with a strike with on his back, Machida was out of the fight. Just wasn't coming back from it. And so it's tough. And even guys like Dan Henderson have held Machida down. Mm-hmm. And that's not Dan Henderson's not a great top control fighter. So it's tough. Luke Rockhold, not an exceptional offensive wrestler, as you said, but I definitely think of him as an excellent transitional fighter. And in terms of pure wrestling, he's an excellent chain wrestler, an excellent, much in the way that Daniel Cormier is. He will stop your takedown. He will spin around to your back, and he'll put you in a headlock or something. He'll find a position from which to punish you for attempting to wrestle with him. Or for just agreeing to wrestle with him. And that's the thing. Machida's always been a little too apt to agree to the opponent's fight.
Yeah, kind of on that note. I mean, this is just a totally random observation. I'm always fascinated by guys who go against the general type produced by their gyms. Mm-hmm. So AKA is full of really dominating top control wrestlers and guys who like to throw hands in the pocket. And Rockhold is very much not that dude at all. He is the opposite of that. So you can see how if you're a guy who's sparring all the time with Daniel Cormier and Cain Velasquez, you would want to develop a really rangy kicking style with a nice counter as a guy comes in on you. You know? You can see how if you're constantly rolling and wrestling with guys like that, you're going to end up a counter wrestler and a counter grappler more so than somebody who initiates those exchanges in the first place.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to put it. Rockhold's game looks like a game that has been developed to beat the games of the other fighters at AKA.
Yeah, and you see this from time to time. I mean, he reminds me a lot of Andre Fili. At Alpha Male. Not that Andre Fili is as good a fighter as Luke Rockhold is, but very similar in terms of the way that you respond to the pressures that are put on you in that environment.
Yeah, that's really fascinating, actually. Whereas Lyoto Machida kind of molding to his new environment. I don't know how much is Machida working with Cordero now. Do you know?
I honestly don't know. This is the thing about Black House and the guys who work there. It is pretty secretive. It's way more secretive than any other gym environment that I've ever been around or knew people around. They don't post a lot of photos. You don't get a lot of guys coming out of their training session saying, "Oh, great to train today with X, Y, and Z people." Mm-hmm. Their training facility is, as far as I know, private. They don't teach other classes there. It is strictly for professionals who have some sort of more or less explicit connection to Ed Suarez.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting.
Yeah, it's kind of a weird environment. You really don't know what's going on in there with anything. You look at Luke Rockhold's Instagram page and you see tons of videos of him doing cardio and hitting pads and him working like there was a video of him wrestling with Khabib. You're not going to get a whole lot of that out of the Black House guys.
Now, I really want Lyoto Machida to win. I will admit to that much. Is this how it is when you watch Yoel Romero fight, Pat? Do you get nervous when Yoel Romero fights?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
I get nervous for Lyoto Machida, which is why I always enjoy and always hate his fights, because they're always some way they're so damnably close. When you really like a fighter, you make him out to be 10 times more fragile than he actually is in your mind. Mm-hmm. You're like, oh God, yeah. Please don't get hit by that punch. Even if he can actually take it. So, but I do agree with you. I think Rockhold might be a pretty bad matchup for Machida. But boy, I just hope that Machida can strategize for him. So let's go back a little bit and let's try and in the three fights that we're discussing today, let's try and touch on the heavy bag question we answered at the start of the show and look at it through the lens of game planning. So if we have each of these guys, obviously we both kind of agree that Rockhold probably has the innate advantage in this matchup, the innate stylistic advantage. But if we're talking about strategy, how does Lyoto Machida beat Luke Rockhold? Just off the top of your head, obviously we're not going to be doing intense scouting or anything. And how does Luke Rockhold prepare for Lyoto Machida? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so I think if you're Machida, just do you. Just do the things that you normally do. Don't worry about the fact that he's a southpaw. Let your shots go. Mm-hmm. Rockhold is not a tremendously quick-paced fighter, which is something that has been a bit of a problem for Machida in the past when he's fought guys like Weidman and Jones, who throw a lot of strikes. Rockhold's not going to work at that kind of pace. So as strange as it sounds, Machida could outwork Luke Rockhold if he lets his shots go. If he isn't looking for the perfect shot, if he's looking for the shots that are there, that Rockhold is giving him, then I think that he could handily take a 5-round decision if he doesn't get Rockhold to run into the big shot, you know?
Yeah.
So if I'm Machida, I'm worried about my process. I'm thinking about my process. I'm thinking, I know I'm good at escaping the clinch, but I got to keep my back off the fence as much as humanly possible. When Rockhold gets me in the clinch, I need to get out right away. You don't want to fuck around with Rockhold on the mat. You don't want to wrestle with him. You want to get out of those situations as quick as humanly possible. You want this to be a pure striking match in the center of the cage. That's where you have your edge.
And ideally, I think, at least in spurts, you want to push Luke Rockhold back. Rockhold is not a bad counterpuncher, as we said, but really it's his one counterpunch. It's a particularly tricky one, the right hook, because it allows him to punch while retreating. It's a very instantaneous counter. It's a same-time counter. But there's not a ton to look out for when chasing Luke Rockhold around the ring. So ideally, I think. Now, for Luke Rockhold, I guess I'll go first here when it comes to beating Machida. I think for Rockhold, you want to pile up a trite of damage as much as you can from range. I do think that Rockhold has such a big reach advantage. I think he's going to be wanting to kick. Here's the thing. We have to remember, how many years does Rockhold have on Lyoto Machida?
I think he's 5 years younger, and I think he has 5 years less experience in MMA.
And Machida, especially lately, taken more shots in his fights than ever before, really. He's been in his toughest matchups against the most dangerous strikers that he's faced in his career. And while Rockhold may not be, objectively as dangerous as those guys, he's more than dangerous enough to give Machida pause. So I think you really have to do your best to take away some of Machida's confidence, like Chris Weidman did to Machida for 3 rounds in their fight. You need to throw kicks at him. You need to push him backwards without ever lunging in. You need to take advantage of the fact that you're a southpaw and throw that right hook when it's close to his jaw. And I think you need to phase shift as much as possible. I think that Rockhold will really, really benefit from being able to put Machida against the fence, use that as either an opportunity to run Machida into his kicks, or use that as a chance to get in on Machida's hips, get him into the clinch where he can knee him, push him around and tire him out, and ultimately drag him to the ground. Machida's not a bad clinch fighter, but like we said, once he's in the clinch, he's kind of in the clinch. He's never been the best phase shifting he's ever shown was when he knocked out Thiago Silva, and it was really kind of a one-off occasion.
Yeah, that has never really reemerged as a consistent part of Machida's game.
Yeah.
The kind of on that note, an interesting kind of general observation about kicking a guy like Lyoto Machida, a guy who likes to move, a guy who likes to move laterally, who likes that circular directionality out in the cage. The reason, more than anything else, that you want to kick a guy like that, that kicks are particularly effective against a guy like that, is because you can attack space with kicks instead of attacking a target.
Yes.
Right. So you can walk a guy like that into your kicks. You just throw the low kick. Maybe you land close to the knee. Maybe you land with the instep. But that's a lot of margin for error right there. That's a lot of margin for error.
Yeah.
So you can catch a guy at various points in the arc. You've got a lot of room to quote unquote screw up with the strike and still land it.
Yeah,
repeatedly.
Especially throwing to the body. I think that's why wide body shots, whether it's in boxing, kickboxing, Muay Thai, MMA, those are always the best way to, if you're not going to really trap a guy in a corner or against the fence or against the ropes, at the very least you can make him pay every time that he escapes. You
Exactly.
at least have to take a piece out of him. You got to take a bite out of him every time he moves away. And I think that's such a good way of saying it. I wish I thought of it myself. You attack the space, because no matter what Lyoto Machida does, if you throw your left kick and he's moving to his right, he will run into your kick at some point or the other. He can't evade it when his back is to the fence in particular. He can't, move his body out of the way because you're throwing it to his body. It's going to hit his arm. It's going to hit his hip. It's going to hit his ribs. Something. He's going to have to run into it. It takes a lot out of a guy. Especially, I think Rockhold has underrated power in those kicks. I think he gets a lot of torque on him with that long reach. He's got that kind of weird semi-shilt thing going on where there's just a lot more mass behind each of those strikes than it appears.
Yeah, I mean, Rockhold is a huge middleweight. If this were 5 years ago, Rockhold would have been a big light heavyweight, and now he's a big middleweight.
He's 6'3".
Yeah, I bet he walks around at 220 or 225.
I don't doubt it. Yeah.
Like if not even bigger than that. So I think that if you're Rockhold, you want to kick repeatedly, kick. Again, because the advantage to that length is it's hard to counterpunch a rangy kicker like that when you're the shorter guy.
Yeah,
it's going to be hard for Machida to cover that distance, especially so now. I mean, this isn't something that we've raised as we've been discussing this, but Machida is not the spring chicken that he once was.
No.
You know what I mean? Like he's a little slower. He's made up for it by getting on a better strength and conditioning program than he was ever on in his younger years. So he's kind of masked it. But in terms of his straight line movement, the last fight where we really saw him exploding very, very quickly the way that he used to was when he fought Ryan Bader. So that was almost 3 years ago now, was the last time we really saw that kind of straight line explosive movement out of him. So I think that lessens the risk for just repeatedly kicking the hell out of Machida as opposed to what it would have a few years ago. So yeah, I mean, that should be the matchup. If you're Rockhold, kick him, get him moving back to the fence as much as possible, throw your straight left and move into the clinch, try and hold him there for as long as possible, wear him down with knees to the legs and the body. And eventually that's going to either open up your headshots or you're going to win a decision, one of the two. Or
choke. I think a choke is a likely finish to this fight, actually.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Luke Rockhold's quite the guillotine and rear naked choke specialist. So Luke Rockhold mounts you or gets your back, either or, because he transitions well from one to the other. It's a rough spot to be in. Yeah, or the mounted triangle. Didn't he have a mounted triangle on Tim Boetsch?
He used the mounted triangle to set up a modified Kimura.
Oh, Kimura, that's right. Yeah, he's a nasty man. He's a bastard when it comes to submissions. So I'm going to hate Luke Rockhold after this fight, but I do think he's probably the best pick to win. But the show's going to take a hiatus for 3 weeks afterwards so I can recover emotionally from seeing my favorite fighter lose.
See, you say that, but I didn't take a break after Yoel Romero pulled out.
He just pulled out. He's fine, Pat. He's fine. He's coming back.
Is he? He's older. He's an older gentleman. You don't know that.
You're like a dog when his master leaves. Like, what if he never comes back? He's gone forever.
It could be. He could be. But
He's an older gentleman. He's 100 years old, as we discussed earlier.
You say that, but he might be.
Okay, folks. Well, that does it for this segment. We're going to come back and look at the other two matchups. What were they again? Dariush.
We're going to look at Dariush Miller and then
Swanson Holloway.
And then Swanson Holloway. We'll probably be real brief on Dariush Miller. We're running out of time.
Yeah. And we're going to look at those both in terms of stylistic matchup, and we're going to talk game planning a little bit as it comes to those fights too. Okay, so here's another way you can help us out. Go to your couch, lift up the cushions, and scrounge around in the creases for change, lint, like bent paper clips, like a thumbtack that you stab your thumb on and then you scream alone in your living room. Throw all the stuff out except the change. All right, now take that and deposit it into your bank account or your PayPal account. Head over to heavyhandspodcast.com and click on the donate button on the right side of your screen. Whatever money you just found, which you weren't using anyway, send it to us, all right? Because Pat and I will use it. That money helps us keep this show on the air and free of charge, which is great for you. It's great for us because that way we're making a little bit of money. The donations are a huge deal for us. So please go to heavyhandspodcast.com. Any spare change that you might have lying around, hit the donate button on the right side of the screen and send it our way to help us keep this show live. Thanks. And now back to Heavy Hands. All right. Now let's get Dariush Miller out of the way first because I think there's a lot more to say about Holloway versus Swanson. Opening thoughts. Jim Miller versus Beneil Dariush. Of course, Dariush taking this fight on, 3 weeks' notice? 4 weeks' notice?
4 weeks, I think, yeah.
Freshly off of his dominant win, more or less, over Darren Cruikshank, which was a hell of a fun upset, one that I was very happy to have called correctly. What do you say? Miller versus Dariush, what are the keys in this fight, Pat?
Well, I think the key for Dariush is going to be pace. One of the things that's been really striking to me watching Dariush fight is how fast he's improved. He's made really rapid improvements. I I wouldn't shut up about how good I thought Dariush looked when I went down to Kings and watched them practice in December. I stick by that. I think that he's turned out to be everything so far that I thought he could be, and more. But he's a super cerebral fighter, and if you haven't listened to it or you didn't hear it live, I suggest that you go back and rewatch his fight with Cruikshank and listen to him break down his win afterwards. Mm-hmm. And it was mind blowing to me how smart he is, and how much he just seems to grasp the fundamentals of the game. But one of the ways that plays out, he's a very calm dude. He's very calm, not like cold, but just calm. He's not gonna get his heart rate up too high. And the way that plays out in the actual fight is through consistent pace. You never see. He's not one of these dudes who's going to throw 20 strikes 1 minute and 3 the next. He's going to throw 10, 12 strikes every minute over the course of the fight. And that's an underrated thing to be able to do when you're fighting a guy like Jim Miller, who's going to work in bursts. Yep. Miller is a burst kind of guy, and he has a tendency to burn himself out if he can't get the finish by the end of the second or the start of the third round. And that's been a consistent problem for him. Even when he's known that he's going to be in there for 5 rounds, he will get tired.
Yeah, and this is when these are the guys, Miller's very much like somebody like Lozon, these super tactical fighters who think in terms of moves. They just have this encyclopedic knowledge of how to finish a guy, especially the submission artists. They tend to view striking the same way, and so they just get caught up. Miller and Lozon are both guys who just get caught up in these insane paced fights, which is really fun, but they often can't keep it up when the guy's good enough or tough enough to keep going.
Yeah, exactly. And I like the Miller-Lozon comparison here too, because neither one of them thinks about attrition, really.
Yeah.
They're going to go out there and they're going to try and knock your block off. And if they can get you that way, then they'll get you. But they're not the kind of guys who are putting money in the bank for later rounds.
And Dariush absolutely is.
Yeah, look at Dariush will get hit a fair bit for about the first 3 or 4 minutes of the fight. But as we talked about with Rafael dos Anjos, okay, so you eat a jab counter to your body kick, that's going to sting a bit for a while. But I'll trade 10 body kicks for 10 jabs to the face any day.
Oh yeah,
because if you can land those 10 body kicks in 5 minutes or so, by the time the second round starts, the other guy is going to be breathing heavy. His midsection is going to be marked up. In Miller's case, especially, we've seen Miller get worn down from a consistent body assault on several different occasions before. And I think that I actually think that's exactly what's going to happen here. I think that Miller's going to have some success landing hard punching combinations early. As we get into the second round, Dariush's attrition to the body and legs is going to start to take a toll. Eventually, either Dariush is going to get a takedown or Miller is going to try and take him down. And Dariush is going to submit him. I think that Dariush is a much, much more clean and technically sound grappler than Miller is.
I have absolutely nothing to add to that. It's exactly what I would say. Wear Miller down, submit him. I don't know why. I think Miller's going to get submitted. Miller is such a dangerous guy because, like Lozon, he's incredibly opportunistic, but also to the extent that he gets a little over anxious about his submission attacks. And Dariush is just, I think the best way to describe Dariush, which is kind of weird when you think about a guy who excels as a pressure fighter, is that he's clinical. Mm-hmm. Dariush is a clinical fighter. Things happen for a reason. Dariush does not do things without a very good reason behind them. And it comes through more strongly than anywhere else in his submission game, where he is just, it's insane because when Dariush is working to submit somebody, it appears that he's grappling at a gi pace, a gi jiu-jitsu pace, and the other person is frantically trying to escape at a no-gi pace. Like he's that methodical with getting his submissions to happen.
Yeah, his fight with Carlos Diego Ferreira was really instructive in that regard because Ferreira is a decorated submission grappler. I think he's actually like a 3rd or a 4th degree black belt.
Yep.
And Dariush took him apart from top position very, very calmly, wore him down from half guard, managed to pass a few times, but wore him out that way. Just got Ferreira to move under him over and over and over again until eventually Ferreira got tired.
Yep.
And that's exactly what Dariush did to Tony Martin before he submitted him. He wore down. He applied that same kind of thinking to Darren Cruikshank in the striking. Like, think about how much distance he made Cruikshank cover over the course of that fight.
Yeah. And Cruikshank's a guy who's happy to do that. That's the thing. It was brilliant because Cruikshank is a guy who was happy to make these giant movements for the entire fight. And honestly, I think Jim Miller is very similar. He will make these big movements if you make it seem like it's the best opportunity. Dariush strikes. We're gushing about Dariush here, but I really, really think the guy has tons of potential. And he strikes in the way that grapplers set up submissions, where he will basically narrow down your options until you choose the one that he prefers. So if it's going to be a fight where he's going to make you move around a lot because he thinks you think you're good at that, he's going to make you do it so much that you hate doing it by the end, and you're basically willing to lose. It's the same way that a guy will allow a guard pass in order to walk a guy into a clock choke or a I always mess this one up. Bow and arrow choke. Which one can you walk a guy into from the bottom?
I honestly don't know.
I don't know my jiu-jitsu well enough.
I don't know enough about the gi.
I don't know the names, but anyway, you know what I mean.
Yeah,
that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both high on Dariush. I'm a big fan of Jim Miller. He's always been one of my favorite fighters. I think he's just kind of stayed the same while the rest of the division has evolved around him. And Benny Dariush is very much a new school fighter.
Yep, I absolutely agree, and I really think, I mean, Jim Miller's style pays off, but let's be honest, he was losing his fight to Fabricio Camuys before getting a submission. Yep. How was his fight with Yancy Medeiros? Don't remember that one.
It was over pretty fast. Miller landed some on the feet. Medeiros landed some on the feet. Eventually, Miller found a guillotine in transition. But, like, Dariush isn't a dude you're going to find a guillotine in transition on, I don't think. Like, at least not for... No. I mean, Dariush has gone multiple grappling matches with Kron Gracie and not gotten submitted. So I don't know. I just have a hard time thinking that Jim Miller is going to be the guy to find something on him.
I agree.
Could be wrong, but I mean, I'm looking forward to the fight very much.
Same here. It should be an action fight either way. It should be fun to watch. Swanson versus Holloway. This is the one that I've been looking forward to. I think this fight is fantastic. I was excited for it right when it was announced. Before you get to be the guy who calls it, Pat, I'm just going to go ahead and give my prediction. I think Max Holloway wins this fight. I think Max Holloway has made tremendous improvements. I think that Cub Swanson made a couple years of massive improvement from his WEC career and has kind of stopped evolving since then. Now, I say kind of because sometimes I'm shocked at how technically sound and how clinical Cub Swanson's game is. You know what I mean? I think the Jeremy Stevens fight is the best Cub Swanson fight to look at to just appreciate the duality that is beautiful destruction Cub Swanson. Because in that fight, we have sequences with Swanson picking Stevens apart with the jab, as well as Tim Bradley, who he trains with, is ever able to do. Just masterfully moving around, picking him off with the jab, throwing 1-2s, countering with the right hand while moving backwards, doing beautiful stuff. Then we have sequences where he's just flinging right-handed bombs, and then a wild right head kick, doing the sort of classic Jackson Winklejohn thing of just hoping the other guy doesn't see the thing coming because you tried something that maybe looks similar, without really setting it up. And so, Swanson almost seems torn between these two mentalities of being a really good boxer and being a mixed martial artist. And so it seems like whereas Max Holloway is just born and bred to be a mixed martial artist. I think he has a game that is currently perfectly suited for what he does in MMA. And I think we're going to see Max Holloway pressure Cub Swanson. I think we're going to see him push Cub Swanson around with his punches, knowing that Swanson's not a great counter puncher. And once he gets Swanson frequently going on the back foot, I think he's probably going to hurt him.
Yeah, that seems pretty likely to me. I too am picking Holloway in this for a lot of the same reasons that you laid out. One of the things that occurs to me, we've had all of these discussions of stylistic archetypes and where guys fall. Swanson is a pretty archetypal outfighter. He wants to be moving at range. He wants to pick and choose his shots. If he can only hit you with one shot at a time, that's perfectly fine with Cub Swanson because he hits really hard. I mean, he is a tremendous puncher, tremendously powerful puncher. He's happy to put him on you one at a time. Whereas, and so he falls very neatly into that archetype. He displays all of the strengths and weaknesses of it. Holloway is a much more amorphous fighter, I would say.
Yeah.
Like, Holloway can do everything, and he doesn't seem to. And his preferences for doing so are more time based in terms of where he's at in the fight than they are speaking to some deeper personality. He's like, he's totally shapeless in terms of the way that he chooses to switch back and forth between different modes, directions of movement. Sometimes he's circular, sometimes he's linear, sometimes he'll fight moving backwards, sometimes he fights moving forward, sometimes he wants to be out in the center, sometimes he wants to be pushing you back. Like, he doesn't seem to have any innate preferences for what he wants to be doing, and that's a tremendously potent thing. Except, this is for about the first 4 or 5 minutes of the fight. He switches back and forth between all of these different things. Eventually, what he settles into is a very strong pressure game.
Yeah.
Like, it takes him a little while to get there, and he'll try out a whole bunch of different things, and he'll look to confuse you. But eventually, he turns into a pressure fighter.
An insane Tekken combo pressure fighter. And Pat, I want to ask you about, you were saying to me before the show that you actually, sort of inspired by what Max Holloway does, you experimented in your own sparring sessions a little bit with stance switching. And Holloway, of course, well known for being a guy who dynamically switches stance mid-combination. It's often a risky maneuver, but he tends to choose the right time to do it, and he covers distance tremendously fast, something that Chad Mendes and TJ Dillashaw also both do when they get a guy on the back foot. TJ Dillashaw's fight with Renan Barão was basically a clinic on how to do this against a guy who, after his first counterpunch, is really committed to the retreat. So what are your thoughts on why Holloway fights the way he does, having experimented with it a little bit yourself?
Well, it's a tremendously useful tool for a pressure fighter. Because it allows you to continue tracking a moving target as you go, and it gives you more and more and more options for what you can hit them with from every range, and it allows you to continually cut them off as they try and get away. So it's something that I like to do quite a bit anyway. I like to throw and then come down in the opposite stance, and then I'll throw right away from that side. But I really focused on it last week. And, I'm not a good kickboxer by any stretch of the imagination, but it was an interesting and useful thing to think of that as my goal instead of just being a thing that I do, and thinking about exactly what makes it work. But I think it's more useful for pressure fighters than it is for anybody else, because if you're trying to cut the other guy off, constantly switching stances and being able to use that as a tool to cover distance and as a tool to find a new angle from as well while you're moving. I mean, so it's motion in multiple dimensions that stance switching allows you to do while still making you dangerous at every single phase. Like, Holloway can throw everything from both stances. He doesn't have a really defined preference like some fighters do. Like, some guys will switch to southpaw because they like throwing left kicks.
Sure.
Like Swanson is a perfect example of this. When Swanson goes southpaw, 9 times out of 10, he's looking for a left kick.
He's the featherweight Alistair Overeem.
Yeah, that's just the shot that he's looking for from there. And, he does weird things with rhythm to land that shot. It's not like he's just firing it out there because he wants to fire it out there. He's got some tricks for landing it, but Holloway is totally amorphous in that he is neither an orthodox nor a southpaw fighter. He's both at the same time, depending on what you're giving him and where you're moving. Yeah,
and I think the really underrated aspect of that stance switching, or even just good pressure fighting in general, is the intense mental pressure that it puts on an opponent. Because really, a good part of pressure fighting is not hitting the opponent. You don't have to land a tremendous number of clean punches to effectively make someone feel pressured. A big part of it is really just staying within reach at all times and making it known that to the other guy that he doesn't want to be in your reach. This tends to break a guy down. So when we watch guys like Fighting Harada's a guy you guys should check out, people listening to the show. If you've never watched Fighting Harada, Japanese legend, one of the best pressure fighters of all time, very, very well known for having beat Ader Joffre twice, who was one of the best boxer punchers ever. So the thing with Harada's game is very much like Max Holloway. He doesn't switch stances, but one thing Max Holloway does is he's constantly touching and extending his hands as he moves forward. There's always something coming at your face, so you always feel like Max Holloway is either able to touch you or just far enough away that he can take one step forward and hit you. And Harada did this with an excellent pawing jab. He would shuffle his feet forward very quickly, and as you retreated, the jab would just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, constantly extending into your face. Not even really hitting you, maybe bumping your nose, but getting in your way. You can't see where Harada's body is. You can't see what angles he might be taking. You can't see what punches he might be throwing next. All you know is that jab is close enough to touch you, so he's close enough to hit you with something else. And it's a very intensely, it's really a humbling experience to have that done to you, to realize that, I've done all kinds of sparring and fighting and whatnot, and now I'm flinching. This guy is standing in front of me, and I'm flinching, expecting something big to come next. And even though Holloway isn't a giant puncher, he makes his punches hurt because opponents, by the time he starts to really put his combinations together, desperately do not want to be hit by them. And that's what's really fascinating to watch him fight. He's got this intense pressure just by the way that he stays close to you. And I've said this many times already, but TJ Dillashaw did the same exact thing to Renan Barão, just staying so close to Barão that Barão had no time to reset, to rest, to think. He put him in absolute instinctive mode. And, for a guy like Cub Swanson, whose instinct, despite all that he's learned, is kind of to panic and brawl. Swanson was always a guy who freaked out and started brawling, not a guy who likes to brawl. I think that that's really, really going to get to him by the end of the fight once Holloway starts to really mount up that pressure. It's got an extremely attritive effect, even without having to rack up damage.
Yeah, and you could see that very clearly when Holloway fought Cole Miller, who is a drastically improved striker. Yes. By the way, Miller is not anywhere close to the kind of shuffling, pawing striker that he was for a long time.
I would describe Cole Miller as a good striker. I think he's a very good boxer, actually.
Yeah, I mean, and you could see that even with Cole Miller, who Holloway didn't actually hit him all that much. Nope. Like Miller did a really good job of taking Holloway out of his volume punching wheelhouse and shutting down his pressure game. Miller did a really good job of that. But still, by the third round, the fact that Holloway was always just there. Yep. Always on him, always throwing, even if he wasn't landing at anywhere close to his normal rate, was still enough that the third round was just clearly Holloway's.
Yeah.
Like Holloway was there for that.
And Holloway, for that reason, is like the ultimate crescendo fighter. It helps that he has tremendous stamina, but it's not just his pace. It's just the way that he applies his fighting style. Once he gets into his comfort zone, he's far more comfortable staying close to you than you are staying close to him. And until he fights a guy who's willing to just let that happen and is willing to stand in the pocket and counter him, he's going to probably keep beating top 10 guys at featherweight. It's a very, very difficult style. And it should also be noted that Cole Miller has a lot more reach than somebody like Cub Swanson. So,
yeah, I mean, Swanson is a guy who depends on his legs to cover distance.
Yes.
And that's and that works for him. It works really well because his movement is kind of arrhythmic and offbeat, and it's very hard to time directly unless you're going to stay right on him. And that's something that more than anything else is the reason why I'm picking Holloway here, is because Holloway is going to stay right on him, even if he's not necessarily pushing him backwards. Holloway is going to be there with him. Yep. And if you can eat Swanson's punches, and I actually don't think Swanson is a tremendously hard puncher when he's not moving forward. I think he really depends on flinging his body weight into his shots to generate force.
I agree. He's like kind of like a Nassim Hamed. Like, as long as he's got his weight moving forward into the punch, he hits hard. But, moving backwards, it kind of goes away.
Yeah, and I don't know that I have ever seen Holloway backstep punching. I've seen Holloway or Swanson backstep.
I was going to say, I've definitely seen Holloway doing it.
Yeah, Holloway will absolutely do it. No, I don't think I've ever seen Swanson backstep punching. If Swanson's going to counter, it's going to be him planting his feet and throwing.
Yes.
And if that's your deterrent to get guys to stop pressuring you, a guy who's confident in his chin, is confident in his volume, is confident in his power, like Holloway is really hard for that. We saw this with Renan Barão and TJ Dillashaw. I mean, not to keep coming back to that as an example, but it's just a really salient one of what happens when your whole strategy to keep guys off you as an outfighter is just planting your feet and throwing really hard. Yeah. There are limits to that. And
Renan Barão is very comparable to Cub Swanson in that regard. And it's very important to note how that style affects somebody, because in that fight, Barão started to get his way back into the fight. You could argue that he won the second round. It was very, very competitive. But Dillashaw just kept doing his thing. So, he caught Barao early. Then Barao began to recover. Then Barao began mentally to wilt. He just couldn't take the pace and the extreme uncomfortable closeness of Dillashaw at all times. And so he was just constantly under duress at all times. It was no rest, no breathing room. You start to break. You start to want to be finished at a certain point. You want the fight to be over. And, not to accuse any fighters of mental weakness or anything. It's just something that happens. You don't want to be put through that kind of meat grinder. And that's Max Holloway. We should, however, point out, Cub Swanson did have a hell of a backstep punch when he knocked out Ross Pearson.
Yeah.
The check hook point that he knocked out Ross Pearson. And it's a punch. He does throw a check hook occasionally. I think it's probably, it strikes me as the kind of thing where he saw Floyd Mayweather do it, and he was like, I want to learn that. And he does it pretty well, but it's not really consistent. And you got to be pretty reckless coming in, I think, to get caught by that.
Well, and to speak, what we opened the show with, the conversation that we had about game planning. Swanson is not a guy who himself believes in game planning. I'm sure his coaches do it for him, but he is not a guy who goes in there with a real plan about what he wants to do and what direction he wants to push you. And I think that's easy. This just occurred to me, but I think that that's more possible for outfighters than it is for anybody else to just go in there, see what they're giving you. Move your feet, keep moving, don't get yourself backed up, and just go.
You can
just
suss out what's there over the course of the fight.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's more possible for outfighters than it is for, say, boxer punchers who need to find their spots or create the spots where they can get you into exchanges, or for pressure fighters who need to figure out how to cut off your movement and force you backwards.
Sure.
I think it's easier to do that as an outfighter.
But I don't think it's particularly viable against Max Holloway.
Yeah, I think you really need to have a plan for what you're going to do to him. And that's not to say that Swanson's coaches cannot have programmed him with it, but it's harder if you're not an active participant in that process.
Agreed. Okay, well, those are our predictions. We're going with, I think we agreed on all of them. We're going with Rockhold, Dariush, and Holloway, and more than anything, looking forward to the fights. Unfortunately, I will be covering what should be a good fight, Julio Cesar Chavez Jr. versus Andre Fonfara. But I won't be able to watch UFC on Fox 15, so I'm going to have to DVR it and avoid the internet.
And I'm sure we're going to be talking about it a bit next week. We also have one of my personal favorite fighters, Demetrius Mighty Mouse Johnson, fighting at UFC 186 against another guy I know you enjoy, Connor, Kyoji Horiguchi.
Love Kyoji Horiguchi. I'm actually bummed that he's fighting Johnson because I just don't think he's ready. I think he's the kind of guy who could beat Johnson down the road. So hopefully he doesn't get beat too badly, but I'm definitely looking forward to it. I think that does it for us, Pat. I think we are good to go. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. You can find us on social media if you want to get in touch with us. I'm at BoxingBush on Twitter. Pat is at Pat_Wyman. Patrick_Wyman, I'm sorry. You can email me, as I said earlier in the show, Connor at heavyhandspodcast.com. Send us questions, suggestions, requests, anything you have pertaining to the show. By the way, heavyhandspodcast.com is where you can find this and all of the other episodes we've ever done. You can also find them on Bloody Elbow. There's been some really good discussion in the comments in our last several episodes, so I encourage you to find these. Our episodes come out every Wednesday morning on bloodyelbow.com, so you can go over there and join the discussion. There's always some nice salient points being shared in the comments. So I guess that about wraps it up. Thanks for joining us, everybody. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.